I'm Belinda and today I'm interviewing Rodney Eggleston. We're going to talk about hands-on processes and hands-on approach in architecture. And we have here Rodney. Hi, Rodney.
Hi, Belinda. How are you going?
Good. How are you going? Where are you?
I'm just in the other office, just the mobile office at the moment.
Good, awesome. Okay, I'm going to introduce briefly Rodney. Rodney is an architect and founding director at March Studio. He's trained and taught at RMIT University, followed by a short but informative 2-year stint working for Rem Koolhaas at OMA in Rotterdam. He returned to Australia in 2007 and set up March Studio with French native artist Anlo Cavignon. March Studio represents a new generation of architects in Australia who have been educated in a digital environment but embrace the fundamental elements of making and innovation to realize their projects. The outcomes of this particular mix are highly crafted projects born and refined through utilization of the digital and computational processes, but also embedded in thorough knowledge of materials and construction. Before to start my questions and interviewing with Rodney, I would like to make a little acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we meet today. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Indigenous people of other communities here with us today. So Rodney, we're going to talk about hands-on approaches in architecture and how you integrate this into your own practice. We're also going to talk about how the practice has changed in this year. So I would like to connect my first question to this. How has the practice changed in this year and a half of pandemic? And where do you think it's going?
Thanks, Belinda. And I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. The pandemic, it's been an interesting one, particularly for Australia. I mean, as you know, Australia is separated from the rest of the world somewhat, and in recent times we've felt that separation is even more so. The ability to get back to Europe or to travel to the States has obviously been somewhat restricted and taken away from us. And as a result, we're finding that we're looking into ourselves a lot more. We're looking into our own culture, our own way of doing things. For many years, Australia has felt like it's always following a bit the rest of the world, and the way that influences have affected some of the design choices or decisions or styles, for want of a better word, that have emerged in this country have often followed, what's happening overseas. So the first point is that I think there's this tremendous opportunity for Australia to redefine what Australian design is. And as a result of being this new idea of localism and not being able to travel, we see this rebirth of regionalism, and we see this rebirth of travel within one's own country that has this tremendous opportunity, both through design and food and culture and all sorts of other pursuits. It's a really exciting time to be in this country, I think, and to work in design because of those factors. And it's not without its challenges, though. I mean, obviously, the price of building has gone up. There was this kind of hesitation when the first few lockdowns came through that we would never build again, and we would never go to a restaurant again, and we would never sit in a picture theatre again. And our projects all got put on hold virtually instantly, and this fear obviously came about. But I think now that we're learning to live with this pandemic and with this virus, we're finding that there's this new hope, and suddenly we've turbocharged our economy. We've never been busier, and suddenly everybody wants to build everything instantly, which is great. But it's sort of managing, I guess, the expectations of the economy and the change of pace. I think is going to be the big challenge for architects and designers. Is how do you still do what you did before, but in a systematic and thoughtful manner.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a new time, that's for sure. Great question.
Yeah. And it's great to be in Australia, as you were saying before. There's a lot of happening here, and this has created a really challenging but vibrant environment for us now. And yeah, we're very, very lucky.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk with you a little bit about materiality, digital manufacturing, and the theme that we brought today indeed was beyond digitalization and remote working, the architectural practice remains profoundly rooted in hands-on methods. So understanding materials, digital processes, and manufacturing techniques is a key to understanding the future of the practice. What's your methodology when approaching materials? What's the role of the material in architecture, and what's your preferred one to work with? I mean, all your projects are characterized by this monomateriality often. How can you achieve this?
It's a really interesting question, and given the times as well, I think it's a very poignant question as well. And really, the investigation of materiality comes from our beginning as an architecture practice. We started in 2007, and 2007, 2008 was the last big global financial crisis, the GFC. And there was, again, at that time, a real fear that we wouldn't be designing, that, you know, architects would be baristas and driving taxis because they're usually the first to go. I mean, you don't need an architect if you can't afford to renovate, for example. And what we sort of found ourselves starting an architecture and design company at the worst possible time, really, at the beginning of a GFC. And what we learnt out of that was this kind of ability to start thinking through making, and that designers and architects have this amazing ability to add value if they use their hands and if they find some substance in the way in which you make or design or build something. So we always joke about it at the studio. If we produce a drawing package, it's only worth as much as the paper that the drawings are printed on. But a builder always has this ability to send big invoices because you can physically see the change. And we identified that was going to be the way to cut through and start a practice, was by building installations, building art pieces, building shop interiors ourselves as a way of getting traction and getting our kind of foot in the door, so to speak. And what we learned was that we sort of started learning materials, and we started having this, I guess, love affair with certain materials. And we wanted to then teach ourselves about one material per project. So RMIT was a fantastic education, but
We can't hear you. Just a second. We can't hear you, Rodney. We're trying to resolve. Yeah, it has been really interesting, especially I would like to remark the thinking through making. I think is really important to understand how materials are able to be in dialogue with the architecture, and not to be an accessory, a second stage of in the interior side, for example. So March Studio and Rodney is like really know well how to work with this factor. I'm gonna try to see if we can reconnect. Rodney. I would like to go through him a few other questions like digital manufacturing, teaming, and materiality, and dive in more. We'll see if he's able to reconnect.
Sorry.
He's back.
Sorry. Someone just tried to call me and it just knocked out the connection completely. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, so as I was saying, we started this relationship with materials and using one material and learning everything we could about that material and finding a language that was articulated through the technique of the material. So if we were stacking timber, then it had this kind of identity of stacking and frayed edges, or if we were hanging or suspending, then it would have a kind of a language of the curve and what is the kind of perfect curve to hang a sheet of yellow tracing paper at, or something similar. So it began a really strong way of thinking about architecture, was this I guess necessity to make and the necessity to build, and the way in which you do so through materials. I think we find ourselves often drawing details and zooming into details, but not understanding how they go together. So for us, it was this real opportunity to understand how things went together, and we try to embed that thinking as much as we can into all the work we do and into our practice, so that we're designing things that are achievable and we're designing things that are real.
Yeah, I really loved the thinking for making because it's real. I was saying before that materiality and the construction process is something, especially materiality, belongs to the architecture itself. It's not, in what I think, an accessory or something that comes afterwards in the interior space, but makes the whole architecture piece. I would like to dive into a little bit more about, you have already touched on your hands-on approach, but what does this mean for you in your everyday practice? And what impact can a similar attitude bring to the broader architectural design practice, where often remains very theoretical and doesn't have this direct approach with the detail or the ability of knowing how something is really made?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's one side of it, I guess, is this yearning for craft and for materials to be authentic, and given the pandemic as well, now we're forced to use local materials and we're forced to use local industries again, which is really great, I think, because Australia particularly lost its manufacturing industries. It lost its knowledge. We used to make cars here, and we don't make cars here anymore because it's cheaper to make them anywhere but here. The labour is very expensive in Australia, because we strive to have this incredible quality of life, and what we've lost is obviously the ability to manufacture. And with one car manufacturing plant, you would have then 100 factories that would be supporting that car industry, making the springs for the chairs, or spinning bits of metal for wheels, or there's all these techniques that we noticed when the car factories started closing down, had to retool and had to work out ways to survive. And beyond then the craftsmanship of materiality, we're really interested in how do you then use manufacturing, and how do you then use digital manufacturing in architecture, because there's a lot of people looking at robots that are printing buildings, or there's obviously CNC technology that's been around forever, but we find that to be quite limiting. We think that through manufacturing and through industry and through digital manufacturing could be just sending someone a 3D file, for example, and the automotive industry and these other industries are far more advanced, well, in Australia anyway, than the building industry is. So how do you then embed that into practice so that you design a 3D part that gets sent to a factory and made and then sent to a site that gives you the ability to unlock a design. So we're talking about customized clips, we're talking about customized fixings. We're not talking about making the whole building out of one digital process, but sort of finding the junctions where two materials might meet and digitizing that and manufacturing that as well, so that you get new forms of architecture and new possibilities that you otherwise wouldn't have. And if you look at our projects on our website, whilst they might look like they've just been sort of made up on site by the builder, they're actually highly kind of calculated and derived and tested and costed, and they've gone through all the processes that computers enable us to do. So with the day-to-day running and making, for us, it's the digital manufacturing side of things that is really key to finding that kind of new form of architecture that might be able to exist and moving into the future.
Yeah, and thank you for this this point of thought, because I think industrial design is really one of those focal points in your architecture, but extending that to every building that effectively works. Is strongly connected with the industrial world and industrial design. Yeah, I would like to ask you something to move on a little bit more on the practice and the broader architectural field now. On the keyword of teaming, how important is collaboration between different practices, and how do you effectively achieve this when working on large-scale projects or small-scale projects, and keeping that individuality as a studio?
Great question, and I think a really important question when it comes to obviously being a designer or an architect, and then trying to work out what type of designer or architect you want to be. And do you want to have 10 people, 20 people, 500 people? It's sort of this idea of success and growing, I think in the past has always been attributed to how many people you employ. And there's been this sort of interesting drive by a lot of practices to grow and grow and grow and grow, bigger, bigger, bigger. And what we find or notice is that their work gets kind of worse and worse and worse and worse as they get bigger and bigger. And we sort of identified this. We've been up to 35 people, I think, in size at one point, and we just found that we sort of lost the ability to be able to really focus on what we thought was important. And so as a result, we like to keep small and nimble. And I think in this day and age, I think that's a really, it's the way to kind of operate, particularly when you're getting locked down here and there. But there's also this desire to work on much larger scale projects, and teaming is really a great way of doing that. And we've had some incredibly successful collaborations with larger practices that are set up for doing those bigger projects, for doing 100, 200, $500 million buildings. And we find that there's, I think, this idea of different offices working together where there might be conflict because one idea is better than the other is beginning to erode in some of these collaborations we're seeing at the moment, because there's an understanding of value of what everyone can bring to the thinking and to the design work. So we've been really fortunate in some of those situations where we've sort of led the design, but we've been supported with the manpower to be able to, knock out 100 floor plans for a tower, for example. And I really do think that with smaller architecture and design practices, this is a fantastic way to begin to challenge the norms of some of the big offices that we find run and dominate the cities, and a really exciting sort of place to be in. Some of the councils in Australia are actually legislating that you have to team up with a small emerging practice these days. And if you do, we might give you more height on your tower, for example. So by obviously lobbying government, there's ways that we can begin to then introduce younger practices and younger thinking and new thinking into the building industry. So I think teaming is a really important part of some of the work that we're doing at the moment, for sure.
Yeah.
Great question, Belinda.
Thank you. I would like to ask you one last question. And I know you teach at RMIT and you transmit your thinking, your process as a young architect. What would be your advice to another young architect or student in initiating his own practice in this moment of uncertainty? What would that be? Like, feel free to be more practical or more theoretical.
I'm not sure if I could be any more practical than what I already am, but there's I'm really fortunate to be able to spend some time with students and have discussions. You know, I don't like to look at it as sharing knowledge, but rather talk around ideas and the way that things are built, and the way in which an architect should respond to site and context, etc. And I'm not sure if it was just when we were educated, but there's certainly a difference, I think, now with student life and students. I mean, when we were students, we rented a factory because the city was cheap, and we all moved in there, and we spent every night working and talking architecture and living through it. And these days, I mean, particularly with the lockdown, when we're teaching, we find that students are often isolating at home with their parents. And you know, my big advice would be you've got to get out there, and you've got to start experiencing and living through your work to make a difference, and to really be engaged with design and the design community and everything that's happening in and around your city. Because in every city there's something amazing happening, and I think it's all about exposing yourself to that and never saying no, always saying yes, always trying to be involved. On a smaller scale, it would be walking down the street, and it would be looking at the way a sign is constructed, or the way a power pole is built, and trying to think about how that might be made, and what material is it, and do you actually know the difference between anodized aluminium and galvanized steel, and why they're different. And I guess the whole world is a built environment where this knowledge is everywhere, and it exists because there's a certain way of doing something. So my biggest advice to any students, you know, whether they start their own practice or not, is to not reinvent the wheel. It's to take from the knowledge and the history of the built environment that's all around you, and try to use that and manipulate it so that it's your own, and give it its little bit of joy, or its little bit of twist, so that you have that ability to transcend architecture and design into something new and unbelievable. And learn how to cook as well. I think it's really important that architects and designers can cook. A lot of our students can't cook, so first task is making lasagna with them usually. I think that's important.
It's a great question. Like, I'm so sorry. That's a great advice. I think there's definitely a component of individuality now that that we didn't have probably even a few years ago. But yeah, going out there and looking how the world actually works is probably my take on from what you just said.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much easier. I mean, when we were students, the internet was just starting, and we had to buy magazines and film. You know, I sound really old, but like these days,
No.
we have students presenting Pinterest images and Instagram feeds, and I don't think that is the way that we should experience and learn from the world through a 2x4 inch screen, even though it's doing wonders for me right now. But the physicality of design and architecture is so fundamental to what we do and the way that we live. So it's really that engagement with physicality and materials that is kind of the most important thing. And I think if we do look at global trends in architecture, I think there is that yearning for that kind of side is coming back quite strongly. So it's interesting to see.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rodney. It has been a really interesting
Thanks,
conversation.
Belinda.
I'm sure
Sorry
there are
about
a lot. It is the city. You're experiencing the city. I'm sure there are a lot of take-ons on this conversation, and I leave you to the next one. Thank you, Rodney. That is Melbourne.
Greetings from Melbourne. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.